Hello everybody, welcome to today's Earth Live lesson. I'm just going to chatter for a couple of seconds to give everybody a chance to join us and tell you who I am. So my name's Mary Gagen and I'm a professor of geography at Swansea University, and I'm going to be talking to you today about trees because I'm a tree scientist, and that's a rather strange thing to do for a living. So I'm sure we've all looked inside a tree trunk, and if you've done that when a tree's been chopped down, you can see inside it. And what we are all really familiar with are being able to see tree rings inside. So when you look inside a felled trunk, you can see these rings going round and round the trunk, and exploring those tree rings is what I do for a living. Why on earth would I do that? Because we have in these tree ring records a really amazing record of what our climate was like in the past. So if I wanted to know what our weather and climate were like last year, or even over the last few decades, as much as the last century really, we have instrumental records, so weather station records, that can tell us what our climate was like. And that tells us that our climate's changing now across the planet and that it's the fault of humans. But if we want to know further back in time, we don't have those instrumental records, and we have to use what are called natural archives of climate. And tree rings are the best natural archive of climate there is. So scientists like me hunt across the planet for really, really old trees that can tell us a bit about what our climate was like in the past, how it changed naturally before humans started interfering with the chemistry of the atmosphere. And that can give us clues about how our climate might change now and how it might change in the future. So with me today, I've got all sorts of props. I've got a conifer tree, I've got a broadleaf plant, and I've got all sorts of bits of wood and one of the tools that tree scientists like me use. So we're going to spend the next 20 minutes learning all about tree rings. And step one is we have to understand a little bit about plants and trees. So broadly, there are two different types of trees that exist on our planet. There are the needle-leaf trees and the broadleaf trees. So throughout this, if you've got grown-ups watching with you, I'm going to signpost you to some search terms that you can look for more information with your kids. So the first thing we're going to do, I realise this is backwards, is learn about needle-leaf trees. The scientific name for them is gymnosperms, and broadleaf trees, and the scientific name for them is angiosperms. So I'm going to put my broadleaf plant down, and we're going to start with our needle-leaf tree, with our conifer. So you will recognise trees like this, maybe in your garden, maybe in parks that you're able to go to safely. And the needle-leaf trees, or the gymnosperms, were the first group of trees to evolve on our planet, and they evolved around 400 million years ago, and they pretty much had the planet to themselves in terms of trees for about 300 million years. And there's something really important we need to know about needle-leaf trees before we can start to think about how they record climate information. So I'm sure everybody watching knows how trees grow. They grow through an incredible process, one of the most amazing biological processes on the planet, photosynthesis. So this tree right now, even though it's just a little baby conifer, is taking energy from sunlight and taking, oops, it's a little bit windy here today, I lost my sign, I'm back. So it's taking energy from sunlight, and it's taking carbon dioxide, CO2 from the air, and they are coming into the tree's needles in some very, very specialized pores, little holes that are on the underside of each of these tiny needles, and they are called stomata. Another search term for you. So what is it about stomata that lets trees grow so big and strong? So if you're going to evolve into a land plant, like the gymnosperms, like the needle-leaf trees first did, you need to be able to get CO2 into your leaf to photosynthesize and let water out of your leaf at the same time. needles and leaves of all kinds need to be able to lose water as they boil. And these little stomata were a key part of evolution that allowed the tree to balance those two things, to lose enough water to stay cool and to take in enough CO2 to grow. One of my favourite stories about stomata are very important to me for my research. One of the scientists who taught us the most about stomata was called Francis Darwin, and he was Charles Darwin's son. And what Francis Darwin figured out, sorry it's a bit windy here today, hopefully you can hear me. What Francis Darwin figured out a long time ago, we knew about stomata from actually about 1675, but Darwin's son worked out that stomata open and close when it gets warmer and cooler, and depending on how much CO2 there is in the atmosphere. So Darwin's son figured out one of the most important things about how trees are changing their behaviour as we pump more and more CO2 into the environment. So I love conifer trees. This is what their wood looks like. They have these very, very nice concentric rings that you can see the structure really, really nicely. We've got another piece here. This is a little fire scar in this particular pine tree ring. So at some point when the tree was this old, a fire moved through this forest and it left this scar in the wood. And then the bark and the wood grew around to seal up that scar until the tree fell down or was felled later on. So those are the amazing conifers, my favourite trees. So the conifers bumbled along, growing across the planet for about 300 million years until about 125 million years ago, when these guys showed up, the amazing angiosperms. And if you think about the planet now, where do pine trees grow? They tend to be isolated to two parts of the planet, either the tops of mountains, the piney areas high up in mountain areas, or the high latitudes. So the pine belts across our planet, where's the mighty globe? Excuse me. Let's grab our earth ball here. So if we get ourselves up into the high latitudes of North America, the pine belt are the boreal forests across here, way, way, way up, circling the northern hemisphere, and then the same in the southern hemisphere. You get piney conifer species way down in the southern hemisphere as well. Excuse me, earth ball. Stay there and don't blow away. So these guys, the broadleaf trees, the angiosperms, have pretty much muscled into the rest of the planet. And the reason they were able to do that is because of their leaves. Broadleaf trees are absolutely incredible because they allow our broadleaf trees, our angiosperms, to be absolutely amazing at photosynthesis. If you're going to have leaves that are incredible at photosynthesis and can live in lots of different places, you have to be able to adapt their shape. And that's what the broadleaf trees can do, and the broadleaf plants. There are leaves that are 2 meters wide that grow on lily pads in the Amazon. There are leaves that are 25 meters long. There are leaves which are adapted to basically make a sealed cup on carnivorous plants like Venus flytraps. So the incredible broadleaf trees managed to spread across the planet because of their amazing leaf adaptations. So we've got here, obviously that isn't a tree, that's a little plant. This, however, is a tree. This is a little poplar sapling. It's actually a hybrid poplar. And it's been safely growing in this pot through the winter, and it'll get planted out sometime in the autumn when we plant small trees in this country. And you can see at this time of year, it's got these little buds on them all the way up. So the broadleaf trees don't keep their leaves through the winter. They lose their leaves in the winter. The needle-leaf trees keep them through the winter. And actually the needles on conifer trees can live to be decades and decades old. But the broadleaf trees, because they need their amazing adapted leaves with a very high photosynthetic capacity, they lose them each year and they grow these buds. And that's what's going on in broadleaf trees right now. If you look, you might have some growing in your garden, you might have some in parks nearby you. So that's the first thing that as a tree scientist, I needed to understand about the difference between, lost my sign, come here Sam. broadleaf trees and needle trees. So we're going to dive inside our tree trunk now. We've got some information about the structure of a tree trunk. So it's really, really important. I'm just going to check with base command that this is all working. Excuse me 1 second. Just letting Lizzie know it's all going fine. I hope you guys can see me. I think you can. So, structure of a tree trunk. I'm gonna grab my MacGyver slides here, and we're gonna look at the structure of a tree trunk. I'm sorry everything's backwards, but we can still have a look at what we're talking about here. So this little schematic helps if I don't have it upside down as well. This little schematic shows us all of the different components that are really important when we start to look inside the trunk at the tree rings to understand what we're looking at. The trunk is made up of bark on the outside, the amazing tree skin, and then inside something incredible called cambium. If you think about how big a tree is, almost all of its trunk tissue is grown from the cambium, this paper thin layer of living tissue that sits just underneath the bark. And in the spring, when the trees wake up and start to photosynthesize and start to undergo cell division to produce the cells of its trunk wood, the cambium does all that growing. One of the things that I think is most amazing about cambium, in parts of the world where food sources could be quite scarce, particularly in the far northern hemisphere, the indigenous communities there, like the Sami people in Lapland, developed ways to eat that cambium if their food source was problematic, if it was a particularly bad cold year. So the cambium, amazing structure. If we move inside then, the trunk wood is actually differentiated into two components. The heartwood in the middle of the tree, which is dead, and then the sapwood around the outside of the trunk, which is still moving fluids, sugars and water to get all the way up to the canopy. So we're going to move on now to look at some of the more detailed structures and look at some of these samples that I've got around me here. But before we do that, I want you to understand a little bit more, because we're going to start with the conifers, on what conifer wood looks like inside the trunk. And I'm very pleased because these dreadful plastic straws that have been sat inside my kitchen and are never going to leave the house or be used finally have a purpose, because I'm going to use them to demonstrate to you what cells called tracheids that run up and down the length of a tree trunk actually look like when we look at them through a microscope. So this is our cross section of our pine tree. Let's turn this tree on its side. So you've got the ring structure there. You can see a heartwood in the middle and the sapwood around the outside. So if I turn this, let's pretend this trunk was fallen on the ground. Its cells are actually like straws that run the length of the trunk like that. They're hollow, and that enables them to move sugar and water up the trunk to get the water and the nutrients from the root of the tree up to the leaves where they're needed for growing and for photosynthesis. So the first thing that we need to do if we're going to learn about tree rings is zoom in on what this wood actually would look like. And we're going to have some more shonky MacGyver slides here. Okay, so if you remember, I said that the conifers were my favourite trees. They evolved earliest and they have a more simple structure in their wood than the broadleaf trees. This is what a tree ring would look like if we zoomed in on it with a microscope. And if my fantastic friend and colleague Scott St. George ever sees this video, thanks for the slides. Bet you never thought you'd see them in this context. So we're going to start. This is the middle of the tree right here. So this would, if this was a big circle, it'd be a big circle of tree trunk going all the way around me. It's blown up and magnified. So we're going to start at this line. That line, that sharp dark line, is winter. The tree shut down at that point. It got too cold for cell division. There wasn't enough light for photosynthesis, and our tree went to sleep for the winter. Then in the springtime, the temperature rose, there was more light, there was more water, and the tree started, we'll jump over here actually because this is where the sign is. The tree started to produce cells which are called early wood or springwood cells. And you can see that they're pale, and that's because, just like our straw cells, they have very thin cell walls and a big airy gap in the middle of them. They're good for getting water and sugar up to the leaves as fast as possible, but they're not very good for structure. So moving through the summer, suddenly there's more light, it's warmer, the tree can produce cells which have a thicker cell wall, and they look darker, they're the late wood. So actually, when you look at the stripiness of a tree ring, when most of us look at tree ring surfaces like this, like on this polished piece, they kind of look like a stripe, a light stripe and a dark stripe, going in rings around the trunk. So 1 year is actually the light stripe with the dark stripe together, the early wood with the late wood together, and that's 1 year of growth. And the other thing that you can see in this picture is why tree rings are so important for recording climate. This ring is narrower than the ring next to it. So in this year, something was different in the climate that this tree experienced, or the conditions it experienced in the forest, compared to this year, where the ring is wider, the wood is less dense, and the chemistry of the wood will be different in this year from this year. And that's how climate scientists like me develop records of what our climate was like in the past from looking at these tree rings. So at this point, before we move on to broadleaf trees to look at their cells, you're probably thinking, she's a tree scientist and she wants to look after the planet. Why has she got all these discs of wood everywhere? So, popping the slides down for a second. The trees that I've got with me today, some of the smaller ones, like this fella, come from plantations where the trees were felled for timber. But the vast majority of them, this guy that we'll talk about in a minute, a bristlecone pine, are trees that fell in the forest and we were able to take samples from them. Ordinarily, as a tree scientist, we don't work with slabs. Normally, we work with something called a tree core, and that is this thing right here. It's about the size of a pencil. And we take it out of the tree with what's called an increment borer. So if I was scampering around a forest looking for ancient tree samples, I would be using this increment borer in order to sample the tree rings. So this spoon is going to go right there. This would get, let's imagine our tree trunk is right here. This will get twisted into the side of the tree trunk. And once we twisted it all the way in, we would use the spoon to extract one of these cores. So obviously, as natural scientists, we don't want to hurt the tree in getting samples out of it. So that's a tree borer that we use to sample trees. Okay, I've got my eye on the clock, so we're going to move on to look at, remember I said the amazing angiosperms evolved later and have a much more complicated structure than our conifers. This is what their wood looks like if we zoom into it. So let's show you a bit of oak before we get started. So we're moving on now to the deciduous trees. This is an oak sample, and you can kind of see it doesn't have that easy structure of the conifers. It doesn't have those simple circles. It's a bit more complicated, and there's lines running across these arrays. The wood structure is more complicated, and when we zoom in with a microscope, we see something very, very different in deciduous trees. So remember I said our deciduous trees were all about losing their leaves in the winter and getting new leaves in the summer. If you're going to grow new leaves, you have to, sorry, I can just see a question. What's the most interesting or beautiful tree you've ever studied? It's the tree I'm going to talk about in about 1 minute. Thank you so much for your questions, guys. I will answer them in the comments afterwards if I don't get to them now. So deciduous trees, the first thing they do when they wake up in the spring is grow these huge early wood vessels, these big holes. Because, for example, an oak tree, a deciduous tree, needs to really quickly get water moving up to its canopy in order to be able to grow new leaves. If an oak tree doesn't produce early wood vessels, it can't survive. And then their late wood, remember the late wood in the conifer was just that dark band. The late wood in our broadleaf trees in our oak are these tighter late wood cells. So the wood structure is very different. It's more complicated, and it's one of the reasons why I love conifers, because they're beautiful, simple wood structure. Okay, so let's just really quickly, I can see time ticking by. So we're gonna whiz through some of these samples. This is a sample from my favorite trees in the world. This is a sample of wood. I'm gonna let you kind of figure out how this would be on a tree because it's hard to imagine the geometry. If you imagine this is a big, like 3-meter disc, this piece is kind of at the end of a radius on the side of the trunk. So the rings across the top of here go like this. And this was sticking down off the side of the tree. And this is a sample of a tree called a bristlecone pine tree. Bristlecone pines are amongst the oldest organisms in the world. They live for thousands and thousands of years. They grow in the Sierra Nevada, an area of the White Mountains in California, way up at very high altitudes. And they are incredible trees. This sample here, and you can see it's, you know, slightly more than my hand span, has 1,400 rings in it. So this little piece of wood indicates that this tree was growing for 1,000 years. Bristlecone pines can live for nearly 5,000 years. And when they die, they stay in that landscape for another thousands of years, another sets of thousands of years. So there are trees in the White Mountains, bristlecone pine trees, that actually lived when there were still woolly mammoths alive on the planet. So they lived for 4,000 years, but died 4,000 years ago. Bristlecones are absolutely amazing trees, and they're some of my favorites. What else can we look at just really quickly before we wrap up? I think I'm just going to wrap up because I've been talking about pines too much. We're showing you this beautiful piece of bog oak. This is a piece of bog oak from East Anglia from about 1,500 years ago. And you can see again that beautiful oak structure, and you can see that this wood is beautifully preserved. So one of the reasons we're able to work back through time a really long way from tree samples in the UK is because when trees fall in colder, cooler areas, in boggy landscapes, they very often end up preserved either in lakes or in peat bogs, and we can fish them out afterwards and work back through time. So what does that look like? And this is what I'm going to finish on. To march back through time to study climate from long ago, we take wood samples from different environments. We might start with a tree in the forest. So we might start with the oldest tree we can find in the forest. And maybe in the UK, we were looking at a pine tree that would get us back 400 years. And then we would maybe sample trees from a building, and that would get us back another few hundred years. Wood has always been used for building, particularly in Northern Europe, and our cathedrals, our archaeological boats, our ruins have old wood in them. After that, maybe we would start looking around in lakes, lake sediments. My Lego has fallen apart, you get the idea. And we would be able to march back through time by looking first at living material, first at dead material, and then archaeological material. And doing that, tree scientists have been able to work their way back through time, thousands and thousands of years, building up a picture of what our climate was like in the past. And the reason that's so important, as I said at the start, is because having that long-term context for climate change from the tree ring record allows us to understand how our climate is changing now and give us some clues about how it's going to change in the future. So that's what I do for a living, and I hope you've understood a little bit about tree ring science, and I hope you've enjoyed this, and thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your questions. I will get to them in the comments afterwards. Bye.